Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to another Honkai Star Rail video. So, in today's Honkai Star Rail video, we will be discussing the two upcoming banners for patch 1.1, which will be Silver Wolf and Luocha. I will be going over all the rated 4 stars on their respective banners, and giving you guys a brief overview of both their kits, as well as providing some suggestions on whether you should be pulling for either of them. And of course, for these type of videos, I always have to give a disclaimer. Pull for the characters you like. Only use the suggestions and information provided in this video as reference to your decision. Alright, let's begin. First, let's talk about the rated 4 stars on Silver Wolf's banner, as they are an important factor to consider when pulling on these limited banners. All 3 of these 4 stars are available for free to all players, with the exception of Serval if you missed the All Stars Invite web event. Then rip you guys. For this reason, I'll be going over their Eidolons, as that will be the main reason why you would want to pull for them in the first place. Starting off with Dan Heng's Eidolons. For his Eidolon 1, when the target enemy's current HP percentage is greater than or equal to 50%, his crit rate increases by 12%. The additional crit rate is much appreciated since it combos well with his skill, which requires you to land a critical strike in order to slow the enemy. And if you are using the 5-star light cone cruising in the Stellar Sea from Herta's shop, your Dan Heng now has the additional benefit of having additional crit rate when the target enemy is either above or below 50% HP. Overall, a very useful and powerful Eidolon for Dan Heng. Now for his Eidolon 2, it reduces the talent cooldown by 1 turn. This is one of Dan Heng's strongest Eidolons in my opinion, because it increases the frequency of which Dan Heng has access to wind resist penetration. And for that reason, he will have more consistent damage overall in his skill rotation. I've had first-hand experience using Dan Heng at Eidolon 2 for a while now, and I can definitely tell you the noticeable damage difference between a Dan Heng with a 2-turn talent cooldown versus one with a 1-turn cooldown. For his Eidolon 3, he gets 2 levels in his skill and 1 level in his basic attack. Dan Heng uses both his skill and basic attack in his skill rotation, so this Eidolon, although nothing special, does greatly benefit him in terms of damage. Overall, not too bad, and any Dan Heng main should be happy about it. For his Eidolon 4, when Dan Heng uses his ultimate to defeat an enemy, his next action is advance forward by 100%. I have mixed feelings about this Eidolon. It basically turns Dan Heng into a budget Su Shang with the condition of needing to defeat the enemy. I don't think this Eidolon is as crazy strong or a must-have like some people might believe. It doesn't help against a single boss enemy, because if you defeat them, the battle is over, you basically win. So the main use for this Eidolon will most likely be against trash mobs for the majority of the time. Having to use your ultimate to clear trash mobs is not the most efficient method, especially considering the fact that Dan Heng's ultimate is the strongest single target damaging skill in his kit. It's probably a better idea to just bring an erudition character to deal with trash mobs if the situation calls for it. Nevertheless, this Eidolon does provide some flexibility for his overall playstyle, but it's definitely not a must-have. For his Eidolon 5, he gets 2 levels in his ultimate and talent, just more raw burst damage and higher levels of penetration. Who doesn't want that? And finally, for his Eidolon 6, the slow state triggered by his skill reduces the enemy's speed by an extra 8%. With this Eidolon, his slow on his skill goes up to 20%. I don't think an additional 8% slow is going to be really noticeable, so just some additional utility for him. It's not going to affect his playstyle or provide him with more damage, so probably a unnecessary Eidolon. Alright, now we move on to Asta. For her Eidolon 1, when using skill, deals damage for 1 extra time to a random enemy. Basically turns her skill from a 5-hit bounce to a 6-hit, which allows for more break potential and energy regeneration. Nothing too crazy, it's nice to have, but it doesn't change her playstyle, nor does it solve her main issue of losing stacks every turn. For her Eidolon 2, after using her ultimate, Asta's charging stacks will not be reduced in the next turn. Now this is the Eidolon that every Asta player wants and needs. With this Eidolon, Asta is now able to maintain her stacks more consistently, especially if you have enough energy regeneration allowing her to cast her ultimate more often. By far her most important Eidolon in my opinion, and a must-have especially for those who plan on building Asta. For her Eidolon 3, her skill and talent go up by 2 levels. The extra talent levels are nice since it increases the attack buff she provides to her allies, but it's only by a small margin and the skill is just more damage overall. I don't really believe this Eidolon is necessary. It's nice to have, but not a must-have. For her Eidolon 4, Asta's energy regeneration rate increases by 15% when she has 2 or more charging stacks. This is where Asta gets her second power spike. 2 stacks is relatively easy to obtain and maintain on Asta, as she's able to generate 2 stacks simply from just basic attacking an enemy that is weak to fire, and she will still maintain 2 stacks after she loses 3 from her max stacks of 5. On top of that, this additional energy regeneration really synergizes with her Eidolon 2, which will allow her to cast more ultimates and maintain her stack count. Definitely a must-have for all Asta players. For her Eidolon 3, her ultimate goes up 2 levels and her basic attack goes up 1 level. I looked it up. You only get 3 more speed for all your allies with 2 additional levels on Asta's ultimate. Yeah, you probably won't even notice the difference. In my opinion, her weakest Eidolon so far. And finally, for her Eidolon 6. Charging stacks lost each turn is reduced by 1. A pretty solid Eidolon. It makes it so that Asta only loses 2 stacks every turn, which will also help her maintain that 2 stack requirement on her Eidolon 4. A very fitting final piece of the puzzle to completing Asta's Eidolons. Alright, moving on to the final rate up 4-star on Silverwolf's banner, Serval. For her Eidolon 1, basic attack deals lightning damage equal to 60% of the basic attack's damage to a random enemy adjacent to the target of the basic attack. It's alright. This Eidolon basically just gives her a bit more AoE damage when she uses her basic attack, and Serval is already really strong when it comes down to AoE damage, so overall not really a necessary Eidolon, it just doubles down on what Serval already does well. For her Eidolon 2, every time Serval's talent is triggered to deal additional damage, she regenerates 4 energy. This is by far Serval's most important Eidolon. Serval is almost always guaranteed to trigger her talent. If not, you're doing something horribly wrong. Against multiple enemies, she'll be able to regenerate enough energy to quickly charge her already low-costing ultimate. And Serval's ultimate is arguably the strongest part of her kit. Therefore, this Eidolon not only provides utility for Serval, but also a damage boost since she will be able to spam cast her ultimate more frequently. I personally would be really happy if I managed to pull 2 copies of Serval for her Eidolon 2. For her Eidolon 3, her skill goes up 2 levels and her basic attack goes up 1 level. She uses both of these in her skill rotation, so it's a pretty nice Eidolon for some bonus damage. Her Eidolon 4, ultimate has a 100% base chance to apply shock to any enemies not currently shocked. This shock has the same effects as the one applied by skill. This Eidolon basically turns Serval's ultimate into her skill, except it deals damage to all enemies. It synergizes really well with her signature Lycone, Make the World Clamor, as well as her second major trace that provides 15 energy at the start of a battle. This allows Serval to sometimes start off a battle with her ultimate to apply shock to her enemies rather than having to use her skill or technique. Overall, some nice utility and added flexibility to her playstyle. Her Eidolon 5 gives her 2 levels in her ultimate and talent. Her ultimate and talent, in my opinion, are where the majority of her damage comes from, so more levels for them means more damage, which is always a benefit for a damage dealer. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, Serval deals 30% more damage to shocked enemies. Not much to say, more damage is always nice, and enemies should always be shocked when you're playing Serval. Okay, next let's go over the rate up 4 stars available on Luocha's Limited banner, which are Pella, Qingque, and Yukong. I'll be briefly going over Pella's skills and traces as not everyone has access to her, especially those who skip the Zile banner. For Qingque, I'll only be going over her Eidolons, as everyone gets her for free, and it's the only reason you'd be pulling for her regardless. Lastly, for Yukong, I'll give a brief summary of her kit with the limited information available, as well as some of my own opinions and predictions about her potential performance. Starting off with Pella. Basic attack, single target ice damage. Skill, single target ice damage and removes 1 buff from the enemy. Ultimate is AoE ice damage with a 2-turn defense shred. Her talent is just energy regeneration on a debuffed enemy, can only trigger once per attack. Her technique smacks the opponent, and it'll deal ice damage to a random enemy and apply a 2-turn defense shred on all enemies. For her major traces, on her first major trace is just more damage to debuffed enemies. Second major trace gives allies an effect hit rate boost. And for her third major trace, when she uses a skill to remove a buff, it'll increase the damage of the next attack by 20%. And quickly moving over to her Eidolons, starting off with Eidolon 1, when an enemy is defeated, Pella regenerates 5 energy. It's a solid Eidolon. Pella's ult, in my opinion, is the strongest part of her kit, so having the ability to cast it more often is always a benefit. Her Eidolon 2, using skill to remove buffs, increases speed by 10% for 2 turns. Also a good Eidolon, kinda situational, but if you manage to remove a buff, the speed boost is greatly appreciated, especially on any support character. For her third Eidolon, her skill goes up by 2 levels and her basic attack goes up by 1 level. Just more damage on a support character whose job is to debuff and strip buffs from enemies. A pretty worthless Eidolon. Her Eidolon 4, when using skill, there is a 100% base chance to reduce the target enemy's ice resistance by 12% for 2 turns. A very powerful Eidolon when paired with an ice damage dealer. Currently we only have Yang Qing, but I can see this Eidolon being very useful and pretty much a must-have later on when more ice damage dealers are introduced. For her Eidolon 5, her ultimate and talent goes up by 2 levels. Not bad, the extra defense shred on her ultimate, as well as more energy regeneration from her talent, is a nice added bonus. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, when Pella attacks a debuffed enemy, she deals additional ice damage equal to 40% of Pella's attack to the enemy. Another useless Eidolon that just provides Pella with more damage, definitely not worth pulling for. Next, we're going to move on to Qing Tre. For her Eidolon 1, she just deals 10% more damage on her ultimate. Considering her ultimate costs 140 energy, which is currently the highest costing energy ultimate in the game, this Eidolon that provides a mediocre damage boost is pretty bad. For her Eidolon 2, every time draw tile is triggered, Qing Tre immediately regenerates 1 energy. 1 energy. Am I missing something here? Is this Eidolon supposed to do something? I don't know. On paper, this Eidolon looks pretty worthless. Maybe with some insane energy regeneration you can make this work, but honestly, it's probably not worth the effort. Her Eidolon 3 gives her 2 levels in her ultimate and talent. Just some more overall damage for Qing Tre. At least it's better than her previous 2 Eidolons. For her Eidolon 4, after this character's skill is used, there is a 24% fixed chance to gain Autarky, which lasts until the end of the current turn. With Autarky, using basic attack or enhanced basic attack immediately launches 1 follow-up attack on the same target, dealing quantum damage equal to 100% of the previous basic attack or enhanced basic attack's damage. Oh boy, more RNG on top of her already RNG-based kit. I will say though, this is quite a large damage boost if you manage to obtain the buff. Overall, an additional reward for those who are willing to gamble using her skill. For her Eidolon 5, she gets 2 levels in her skill and 1 level in her basic attack. It's just more damage. Nothing special. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, recovers 1 skill point after using enhanced basic attack. This is probably her only saving grace when it comes to Eidolons. It provides some helpful skill point regeneration for her extremely skill point hungry playstyle. By far her strongest Eidolon, unfortunately you have to pull 6 copies of her for it. Alright, and finally for the last rate up 4-star on Luocha's banner, we'll be discussing Yukong. She's an imaginary element character that follows the path of harmony, and her skill can increase the attack of all allies, meaning she can give an attack buff to everyone. Her ultimate can buff her skill and increase the crit rate and crit damage of all allies while dealing single target imaginary damage. Currently, we don't have any info for her Eidolons, as that will be the main reason why most people will be pulling for Yukong on Luocha's banner, since we get a copy of her for free supposedly in patch 1.2. And I have a feeling that her Eidolons will be what enables Yukong to become a top tier offensive support. I predict, much like Asta, Yukong will most likely have some downside in her kit that can be resolved or improved with her Eidolons. There's no way Hoyoverse announces that we get a free copy of Yukong and then puts her on the banner right before that patch without any catch. Okay, now we finally get into the limited 5-star characters. I'm going to start off with Silverwolf. To give you guys a quick overview of Silverwolf's kit, she's a quantum element character that follows the path of nihility. She also has a weakness implanting ability on her skill based off the elements of the characters on your team. She also can produce bugs, which are debuffs that can reduce the attack, the speed, and defense of the opponent, as well as a damage resist reduction debuff. And she can also deal high single target quantum damage, as well as apply a defense shred on her ultimate. Next, let's go over her pros and cons, starting off with the pros. For her first pro, she's an offensive and defensive support. This is because she's able to provide both offensive and defensive debuffs. The offensive debuffs obviously being defense shred and damage resist reduction, and the defensive debuffs being attack reduction and speed reduction. Her next pro is that she will be a skill point generator, meaning that she'll be a skill point positive character for your team. This is mainly because she'll only be using her skill every couple of turns, maybe 2 to 3 turns, depending on when you need to implant that weakness onto the opponent. Besides that, she'll just be basic attacking and applying her different bugs on the opponent. And for her last pro, she is of the rare quantum element, which actually synergizes really well with her Nihility path. The main reason is because when Silverwolf weakness breaks an opponent with her quantum element, it actually pushes the enemy back in turn order, which therefore means that her debuffs will actually last longer than they normally would. This pairs really well with any debuffer of the Nihility path. And besides, currently we only have 2 other quantum characters in the form of Zile and Qingtre. If you're not interested in using Qingtre and you did not pull for Zile, your only other option is Silverwolf. Alright, now let's move on to her cons, starting off with her first con, which is her kit is relatively RNG based. Both her bugs and weakness implanting on her skill will involve some sort of RNG. You can technically remove the RNG in her skill if you run a team full of 4 quantum element characters. However, that is currently impossible, so you'll have to wait for that 4th quantum character to be released. For her next con, she needs a lot of effect hit rate. I'm not going to go into the exact details and numbers of her skills because they might be subject to change upon release, but based on my analysis, a lot of her debuffs base hit rate is really low and you're going to need a lot of effect hit rate in order to even land those debuffs. This in turn means she's probably going to have to run a effect hit rate chess piece along with effect hit rate substats and maybe even the 2-piece set for effect hit rate on your planar sphere and link rope. And for her last con, she only has single target in her kit. Therefore, she's not the most optimal character for farming or for boss fights where they spawn a lot of trash mobs. Okay, now I'd like to go over some reasons for pulling Silverwolf. Not reasons why you should pull, keep that in mind, but rather reasons you should consider pulling for Silverwolf or Luocha. I'm not telling anyone to pull for either of these characters, I'm just providing you guys with information and suggestions. And for the first reason why you should consider pulling for Silverwolf is if you already have Bailu, and this will apply to all the reasons that I mentioned later on. On top of that, if you want or need quantum coverage and don't want to use Qingtre for whatever reason. The next reason would be if you plan on making a future mono quantum team. Currently we don't have enough to make a full team, so it's worth considering skipping Silverwolf's banner and pulling on her rerun banner later on when more quantum element characters are introduced. This is of course if you don't have enough Stellar Jade or Special Star Rail passes. If you do have enough, you've been saving ever since the beginning of the launch, I think it's perfectly fine to pull for Silverwolf on her initial banner. And for the next reason why you might want to consider pulling for Silverwolf will be if you actually want Silverwolf herself and are considering using at least 2 of the 3 rated 4-star characters on her banner. I myself currently fit into this situation. I do want Silverwolf as a character, and I am currently using Danhong and Serval, and I believe their Eidolons will actually allow me to power up my second team for the Memory of Chaos. So if you guys are in a similar situation, like for instance you guys have Asta and you need her Eidolons to turn her into that amazing offensive support that you want, then it's probably worth considering pulling on Silverwolf's banner. And for the last reason, it's pretty obvious. If you like the character, you like her design, go for it, pull for Silverwolf. Alright, and finally, let's talk about your boy Luocha. For a quick overview of his kit, he is of the imaginary element, and he follows the path of abundance. His healing scales off his attack percentage and can provide emergency heals without the use of skill points or energy to low HP allies. He can also deal AoE damage and remove buffs on the enemies with his ultimate. And finally, his Abyss Flower mechanic creates a field around the enemy, which allows allies to lifesteal off them during the field's duration. Alright, next let's go over his pros and cons, starting off with his pros. His first pro is that he's a healer, and currently that is a really high in demand role, because at the moment the only other healers we have available are Natasha and Bailu, one of which is a 5-star. This becomes a really huge issue for those who don't have Bailu as a second healer and want to clear the later stages of Memory of Chaos. Having Luocha on your second team will definitely help resolve that issue, and therefore that's one of the main reasons why a lot of people are interested in this character. For his next pro, he has an AoE buff removal, and this can be very useful against certain enemies or future content that will be released. So if there's any future content or enemies that are introduced with very dangerous buffs, or buffs that needed to be removed, Luocha will have the ability to strip them of those buffs and make your life a lot easier. And for his last pro, he has the rare imaginary element. Currently, we only have Welt as the only other imaginary character option. Later on, we'll get Yukong in patch 1.1 on Luocha's banner, as well as a free Yukong on patch 1.2. Even then, that's still only 3 imaginary characters. Alright, moving on to his cons. He lacks a immediate AoE heal. Unlike Bailu and Natasha Ultimate, he can only heal one of his allies in case of an emergency with his skill. So for instance, if you're fighting an opponent and they cast an ability that deals massive AoE damage to your entire team and chunks them all to 50% or lower, Luocha's only going to be able to restore health to one of those characters, leaving the rest of your team vulnerable and at the risk of dying. Versus if you had someone like Bailu or Natasha, you can just press their ultimate and top everyone up to near full HP. For his next con, he's more frail in comparison to your traditional healer that scales off HP. Since his healing scales off attack, it is more optimal to build him with attack percentage rather than HP. As a result, he'll be a lot squishier compared to other healers like Natasha and Bailu. So to combat this, you might want to actually consider investing some HP percent or defense percentage substats in his relics. And for his last con, his Abyss Flower field will require some timing for the most efficient healing. I can see certain situations where players might mistime their Abyss Flower and end up deploying the field at a time when their characters are all at full HP. And then when the time comes, when your characters are low HP and are in serious need of a heal, you won't have that field available. So overall, his kit is not as straightforward as the other healers we currently have. For Natasha and Bailu, I feel like they are less skill dependent versus Luocha. You're going to need some planning ahead and some timing in order to optimize his playstyle properly. Alright, now let's go over the reasons why you should consider pulling for Luocha. Starting off with the first reason. The big one. If you don't have Bailu. If you don't have that second healer. Even if you have JAPON, I'd still recommend pulling for Luocha. The reason is, even if you have that shielder to protect your team, a healer is just a better safety net in my opinion. And on top of that, Luocha's kit is really well catered towards the endgame in terms of a healer. So when it comes time when you're finally pushing for those final stars on Memory of Chaos, and you actually want the additional damage support, Luocha will be a better option than those purely defensive supports such as JAPON or Bailu. And for the second reason why you might want to consider pulling for Luocha is if you want Luocha himself and you are interested in pulling Pela or Eidolons for Qingque and or Yukong. Pela is a great support that can provide defensive shred to all enemies. For those that use Qingque, I believe that she becomes her strongest when you finally get her to Eidolon 6, although that does require you to pull 6 copies of her, so unless you plan on going to full pity on this banner, that's probably not going to happen. And for Yukong, like I stated before, I predict that her Eidolons will be quite strong and complete her kit overall as an offensive support character. Another reason why you might want to consider pulling for Luocha is if you also plan on pulling for Blade in patch 1.2. Blade's kit synergizes really well with Luocha's kit. Since Blade's playstyle revolves him dropping to low HP, Luocha can immediately heal him with his skill and deploy a field that allows Blade to lifesteal back when Blade is in danger of dying. And for the last reason why you might want to consider pulling for Luocha, obviously, is if you like the character's design. To be frank with you, he kinda looks like Flashy Flash from One Punch Man. I noticed that recently due to his blonde hair and even his sword that is very similar to what Flashy Flash is carrying. So I guess a little fan service for those Flashy Flash One Punch Man fans out there. Alright guys, well that's going to be it for this Honkai Star Rail video. Let me know in the comments below who you guys plan on pulling for, whether it's Silverwolf or Luocha. Or if you guys plan on skipping both of them for another future limited 5-star, such as Kafka or Blade. And of course, if you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe, or join if you wish to support my channel even further. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next Honkai Star Rail video. Peace!
Wanna spy? Disappear.